So recently I did a video going through the different delays on the quad cortex, and someone had asked if I could do a similar thing for the modulation effects. So what I wanted to do today was go through the choruses on the quad cortex. I'll do a separate video on the flanders and phasers and other effects. Of course, many of these effects are stereo, so best to listen to this through headphones or at least with some monitors so you can hear the stereo spread of the effects. So what I've got here is a pretty basic preset using a Amazing Boogie Lone Star that's running into a 2x12, and then I've got a very light kind of plateless reverb on the end. And then I am hitting the front of it with the exotic boost just to give it a little extra color. And our bass tone sounds like this. So like edge of breakup area, just kind of a good foundation to talk about the pedals. So let's start off by talking about where to put the choruses in the signal chain. And so I'm going to start out with, I'm going to put it here, and we're going to grab the dual chorus, and let's turn the mix up all the way so that we can really hear the effect. If you've ever used a chorus before, you're probably familiar with the two basic controls on any chorus are the rate and the depth. So, a modulation effect is modulating, the pitch of your tone, and the depth is how far it's modulating, and the rate is the frequency of the modulation. So, for example, if we crank up the depth, pull the depth down, even when we crank the rate all the way up, without any depth, you can't really hear it. When you crank the depth up, the other control here, there's a tone control in this one, which is just kind of altering some of the EQ a little bit, is the width control. And like the delays, the width controls kind of the stereo effect of your chorus. So if we crank the width all the way down, you get a chorus effect, but it's mono basically. If you crank the width up, you're going to kind of accentuate the chorus in its stereo effect. And then just to maybe finish off this chorus, it does have a vibe mode. So rather than a chorus, it's more of a vibrolux kind of thing. That's what the chorus sounds like. Right now we've got it after the cab. And it's a nice stereo effect. If we move it in front of the amp, notice we've lost our stereo effect. That's because the amp is mono, and it's just like with the delays, it's going to force the stereo signal back into a mono one. So even though our stereo chorus has the width set to 100% here, this amp block is pulling that stereo effect just basically back into mono to sound like mono. So if you want the chorus in front of the amp, what you would need to do is run a splitter with 2 amps and make sure that you're splitting the stereo signal. So what you would do is, I'm not going to go too deep into this. I did a whole video around kind of parallel processing, and I'll link to it here. But you'd split here, and you'd make sure your splitter is set to split and not normal, so that it's splitting left to right. And then on the mix, you'd make sure that you're panning your left and right all the way to either side in order to keep that stereo effect. But let's go ahead and we will not do that here today. The other place you can put your chorus is you can't put it after the amp, before the cab. And you'll notice that too is forcing it back to not be a full stereo effect. Now you can, on the cab, you can get some of the stereo back if you pan the mics all the way left and right. You can get some of that stereo back, but it's not quite the same. And so for most of this video, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave the chorus after the cab. So if we put the chorus after the cab, it's really, if you think about it in the real world, what you're doing is you're putting a chorus effect on after you've already mic'd the cab, and it's more like a studio effect or a front of house effect, at the console, rather than a guitar effect. If we're putting it in front of the amp, that's like you're running a chorus pedal into the amp. And if we're putting it in between the amp and the speaker cabinet, that's probably the closest thing in the real world would be like putting the chorus in the effects loop of the amp. So the chorus is coming after the preamp sound. It's not exactly like that, because on the quad Cortex, you'd be coming not only after the preamp section, but after the power amp section. I don't think in the real world you could put a chorus in between the amp and the cabinet in any way. The line level's too high, obviously. But that's probably the closest thing. If you were to have your chorus here, it's more like having the chorus effect within the effects loop of the amp. That's probably the closest real world comparison. But I'm going to leave it here for now so we can really hear the chorus effect as we go through them. I'm going to stick to using the stereo versions of some of these choruses rather than going both the mono and the stereo. So the Chief CE2W, this is the Boss CE2W, which is a great little chorus pedal. If we look here, we've got our mix, we've got our rate, we've got our depth. So turn that up so we can exaggerate the effect a little bit. You've got your width, so let's set it full stereo. And you've got this type. So if we hear just what it sounds like in the bass type, it sounds like this. You can hear it's pretty subtle. Even with the mix at 100%, the CE2 setting is pretty subtle. If you move the type to CE1, this is mimicking the Boss CE1, which I think is an older version of this that's, I don't know, old school and more noticeable. And the CE1V is more of a vibrato effect that the CE1 had. So usually when I'm using this one, I'll usually use the CE2C. It's real subtle, so usually I've got the mix pretty high, so I might have the mix up around, say, 75%. I'll keep the rate around 30. Usually I'll have the depth more around 75 to 80, and keep the width up to keep that kind of stereo effect. So that's the CE2W. we change that out to the DC2W. You notice this doesn't really have your normal rates or depth. What you've got here is a type, and so the type is, the S is the standard mode. So this is the normal DC2W sound, and then you can switch it to the STD320, which is another Boss chorus. So they kind of combine the two settings into one. And then you've got this mode. So the original pedal has like 4 modes. You can select the modes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you can start combining them. So 1 + 3, 2 + 3. And so the original pedal has more combinations you can do, but what it's doing is it's mimicking that ability to combine the modes that was on the original pedal. So the 1 to 4, you're going to get a broader effect. So 1. Versus a 4. And then when you start combining them, like if you combine say a 3 and a 4, you'll get a real deep effect. The drive, the pedal can have some drive on it. You can hear that's kind of distorting a little bit. I don't ever really use the drive, but I guess it allows you to drive the effect a little bit to change the color. It's not something I use a lot. Frankly, I don't use this chorus effect very much in the quad Cortex. I mean, the modes are kind of nice, but I prefer having a fuller control over the depth and rate. So this is the TC Electric 2290. This isn't something that I was very familiar with. It seems that it's a multi-effect rack effect that they've pulled the chorus or modulation capability out of on its own. I think originally it was focused on being a delay with some modulation built in. This isn't one that I use a lot. It's a pretty pronounced effect. I mean, the settings that come when you first kind of bring it up are pretty tame. If you get a little more depth and then pull the width up, you can kind of hear it. Maybe give it some drive. It feels like the rate on it kind of moves quite a bit. I'm not a big fan of this one. So the chorus engine is I think it's just a quad Cortex specific thing. This isn't based on any, original piece of equipment. And there's a lot here, and frankly, I'm not going to go through every single capability it has. You've got your standard chorus things: mix, rate, depth. You've got a tone setting. You've got a delay, which allows you to manage, kind of the space between when the effect starts. So, for example, if we play it like it is now. kind of hear it almost turns it into a little bit of a slapback effect. So that's interesting to play around with. The morph and random, I think, from what I can tell, is just introducing some amount of variability in the way your tone sounds. So the morph, if we go to without the morph, kind of subtly increasing the effect to my ear. And then the random, I think, is doing what it says. It's just kind of, it's making the effect less predictable. So again, both of these, to my ear, are pretty subtle. Crank them both up at the same time. They don't have huge impacts, but they're interesting to play around with. Let's put it back where they were. The voice mode. So to me, this is almost kind of adjusting some of the depth additionally. All right, so the voice mode, I'm having a hard time describing what it does, but you can definitely hear the changes. So again, it's just something, playing around with it, find something that you like kind of settings. On the second tab, you've got some kind of low pass and high pass features there. You can play around those yourself. I don't use those very much on these kinds of effects. Same thing with the delays. You can definitely kind of tune the tone of the effect you're getting if you want it to be darker or brighter kind of thing, but it's not something I use a lot of. Width is your standard kind of stereo spread. And then it's got a drive and a drive type. So you can turn off hard, and we turn it up. Let's hear what we get. Make it soft. I guess edgy is just in between. I'm not a big fan of using the drives on these choruses, but it's there if you want to. Maybe if I was using that, it's like you pull the mix back, and you can have your nice clean guitar tone, and then you can have kind of a driven chorus effect underneath it. That might be. Let's check that out. So let's turn this back to about halfway. We'll pick the in between edgy, the drive all the way up. it's something to play around with. There's a lot of power here with this chorus engine to kind of tweak and play. And so if that's something that you like to do, there's a lot here to play around with. And then back here, you've got the Dream chorus. So this is modeled after the TC Electronic Dreamscape, which is the John Petrucci chorus pedal. You've got, your basic chorus settings here: mix, speed, depth, and then you've got a mode. So the original pedal actually has, I think, 6 modes to it, because it'll do like vibratos and things like that. They just pulled 2 of the 6 out: the CHO, the chorus 1 and chorus 2. Chorus 1 is a pretty pronounced chorus. Chorus 2 is really subtle. Let's hit it with a drive. On this pedal, the chorus 1 is kind of a great chorus to go with a nice sparkly clean tone. And I think this chorus 2, it's nice and subtle and tight to my ear, and so I think it works really well with kind of this driven tone. Turn down the depth a little bit. Clipping there at the end. Oh, just FYI, I'm using the Assessor drive as the drive tone here. Those are the choruses within the Quad Cortex. Again, for me, the ones I use most often is typically I'm going to this E2W stereo for kind of your standard sparkly clean kind of chorus. It's just kind of straight ahead as a chorus. The chorus engine gives you kind of a good tweakable effect. And so if you want to play around with trying to get the exact sound that you want, it's a good way to do it. And I do like that Dream chorus on the channel too, for like if I want a chorus driven sound. So if I'm, I don't know, just trying to get a thick kind of Satriani-ish kind of lead and I want to add some chorus to it that's not over the top, I like that quite a bit. So I hope you found this helpful. And again, I'll do a follow-up that'll focus on some of the flangers and phasers and such. Thanks for watching.